Lily Thornton pressed her small body into the corner of the rusted shed, her 7-year-old frame trembling against the frozen wooden wall. The Oregon winter night had dropped to 5 degrees below zero, and the cold seeped through every crack in the rotting boards, wrapping around her bones like icy fingers that refused to let go. She had no blanket, no pillow, only a thin, torn sweater that had once belonged to her grandmother, the wool so worn it offered little more protection than paper against the bitter wind that howled through the gaps in the walls. In her arms, she clutched a raggedy cloth doll with button eyes and yarn hair, the last gift Grandma Maggie had made for her before the sickness took her away 6 months ago. Lily pressed her face against the doll's faded fabric, breathing in the scent that was almost gone now, the scent of lavender and warmth and safety. "Grandma," she whispered, her breath forming tiny clouds that disappeared into the darkness. "I'm so cold, but I promised I'd be brave." From inside the house, only 20 steps away yet impossibly far, the sounds of warmth mocked her. Derek Briggs's booming laughter rang out. Sharon's shrill voice joined in. The television blared some game show, and upstairs, Kyle's video game explosions rumbled through his speakers. They were warm, they were fed, they were together. And Lily was locked in a shed meant for storing broken lawn equipment, punished for a crime she did not commit. The plate had slipped from her hands during dinner, shattering against the kitchen floor. But it was Kyle who had shoved her elbow. Kyle who had smirked when his mother grabbed Lily by the hair and dragged her outside. Kyle who had watched from the window as his father wrapped the chain around the shed door and snapped the padlock shut. "Problem children sleep with the problems," Derek had slurred, his breath heavy with whiskey. "Maybe a night out here will teach you to be less clumsy." That was 3 hours ago. Lily had stopped feeling her toes after the first hour. Her fingers had gone numb after the second. Now she simply existed in a fog of cold, her body shaking so hard her teeth chattered in a rhythm she could not control. To keep her mind from the freezing, she counted. 47. That was how many cracks she had found in the walls of this shed. She had counted them during her first night locked out here, 2 months ago, when she had cried so hard she made herself sick. She had learned since then that crying only made things worse. Crying made Derek angrier. Crying made Sharon call her ungrateful. Crying made Kyle laugh. So Lily stopped crying. She stopped doing a lot of things. Stopped asking for seconds at dinner. Stopped looking adults in the eye. Stopped believing that someone would come to save her. Grandma Maggie used to say that angels watched over good children. But Lily had been good, hadn't she? She had done everything they asked. She had scrubbed floors until her knees bled. She had eaten scraps from their plates without complaint. She had smiled when guests came over, pretending everything was fine. And still, no angel came. The wind picked up, slicing through the shed's gaps like knives. Lily curled tighter into herself, making her body as small as possible, the way she had learned to do when Derek's shadow fell across her. Then she heard it, a distant rumble, low and steady, growing closer. Lily lifted her head, her amber eyes catching a sliver of light through the crack in the door. Headlights, 3 sets of them, cutting through the darkness at the end of the dirt road. 3 black SUVs, moving in formation, their engines growling like predators approaching wounded prey. The beams swept across the yard, illuminating the dead grass, the broken fence, the shed where a 7-year-old girl sat forgotten. And for the first time in 6 months, something other than fear stirred in Lily's chest. Something was coming But something was coming. The 3 black SUVs rolled to a stop in front of the Briggs property, their engines falling silent in perfect unison. For a moment, nothing moved. The night held its breath, as if the universe itself understood that something was about to shift. Then the doors opened. From the lead vehicle, a man emerged into the frozen Oregon night. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, his broad shoulders wrapped in a black wool coat that cost more than everything the Briggs family owned combined. His dark hair was swept back from a face that seemed carved from granite, all sharp angles and shadows. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, gray as winter storm clouds, cold as the ice forming on the dead grass beneath his polished shoes. Dominic Vale surveyed the property before him with the expression of a man appraising something worthless. The sagging porch, the peeling paint, the broken windows patched with cardboard and tape. His gaze lingered on each detail, cataloging, calculating, judging. Behind him, Jonas Mercer stepped out from the second vehicle, followed by 6 other men in dark suits. They moved with the fluid coordination of soldiers, spreading out across the yard in a formation that was both casual and unmistakably tactical. The front door of the house burst open. Derek Briggs stumbled onto the porch, a half-empty bottle of beer clutched in his meaty fist. His face was flushed from alcohol, his undershirt stained with grease and sweat, his eyes struggling to focus on the figures standing in his yard. "Who the hell are you?" he bellowed, trying to inject authority into a voice that cracked with uncertainty. "This is private property. You got no right to be here." Dominic did not answer. He simply looked at Derek. It was not a threatening look. There was no snarl, no clenched jaw, no raised voice. It was something far worse. It was the look of a man who had seen true darkness, who had walked through fire and emerged harder than steel, who had ended lives without losing a moment of sleep. Derek Briggs had spent his whole life bullying those weaker than himself. He recognized, perhaps for the first time, what it felt like to be on the other side. He took a step backward. Sharon appeared in the doorway behind her husband, her bathrobe pulled tight around her thin frame. Her eyes darted from the vehicles to the men to Dominic, and the color drained from her face like water from a cracked vessel. "Derek," she whispered. "Derek, who are these people?" Jonas Mercer stepped forward, reaching into his coat pocket. He withdrew a photograph and held it up where the porch light could illuminate it. An elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair smiled from the image. She wore a simple dress, and around her neck hung a delicate silver necklace with a violet flower pendant. "Margaret Thornton," Jonas said, his voice flat and businesslike. "You know her." Derek's eyes flickered with recognition, then confusion, then the beginning of fear. "She's dead. Died 6 months ago. What's it to you?" Dominic moved then, climbing the porch steps with slow, deliberate strides. Each footfall echoed like a drumbeat, like the steady approach of something inevitable. He stopped 3 feet from Derek, close enough that the smaller man had to crane his neck to meet those storm-gray eyes. When Dominic spoke, his voice was low, quiet, colder than the winter wind. "I'm looking for Margaret Thornton's family. Her granddaughter." A pause, weighted with danger. "Where is the child?" Derek and Sharon exchanged a glance. In that single look passed a dozen calculations. Who was this man? What did he want with the girl? How much trouble were they in? The kid? Derek forced a laugh that fooled no one. "She's inside, sleeping. It's late, you know? Kids need their rest and all that." Dominic's expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted, darkened, like clouds gathering before a hurricane. Then, from somewhere behind the house, carried on the bitter wind, came a sound, a child's cry, weak, trembling, barely audible, but in the silence of the night, it rang out like a bell. Dominic turned his head toward the sound, and for the first time, his stone mask cracked. Something flickered across his features, something that looked almost like recognition, almost like rage. Jonas Mercer moved toward the sound without waiting for orders. His boots crunched across the frozen ground as he rounded the corner of the house, one hand reaching for the flashlight at his belt. The backyard was a graveyard of neglect, a rusted swing set with no swings, a broken lawnmower lying on its side, piles of garbage bags that had never made it to the curb, and at the far end, half hidden in shadows, a small shed that looked like it might collapse at any moment. Jonas approached it slowly, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Then he saw the chain, a heavy iron chain wrapped around the door handles, secured with a padlock that gleamed new against the rotting wood. Jonas felt his stomach clench. He had seen many things in his years working for Dominic Vale. Warehouses full of contraband, men who begged for their lives, bodies that needed to disappear. But this was different. He pressed his face to the gap between the door and the frame, shining his flashlight into the darkness within. The beam swept across rusted tools, broken flower pots, piles of moldy cardboard, and then it found her. A child, a tiny girl curled into the corner like a wounded animal, her knees pulled to her chest, her arms wrapped around a ragged doll. She was so thin that her shoulder blades jutted through her sweater like the wings of a bird that had forgotten how to fly. Her skin was pale, almost blue in the cold. Her lips were cracked and trembling, but her eyes were open, staring directly at the light, directly at Jonas, with an expression that no 7-year-old should ever wear. Not fear. Something beyond fear. Something that had given up on fear because fear required hope, and hope had abandoned her long ago. Jonas stepped back from the door. His hands were shaking. He realized with distant surprise that his hands had not shaken in 15 years. He walked back to the front yard where Dominic stood motionless on the porch, Derek and Sharon cowering against the railing. "Boss." Jonas's voice came out steady, but something in his tone made every man in the yard turn to look at him. "There's a child, locked in the shed." He swallowed hard. In this cold, the silence that followed was absolute. Dominic did not speak. He simply moved, descending the porch steps and crossing the yard with strides that ate the distance like a predator closing on prey. Each footfall struck the frozen earth like a war drum, like the heartbeat of something ancient and terrible awakening from slumber. He reached the shed. He saw the chain. He saw the lock. And then he looked through the gap in the door. The flashlight beam was still illuminating the interior, still falling upon the small figure in the corner. Dominic's gray eyes found her face, found her hollow cheeks, found the bruises barely visible beneath her sleeves, found her eyes. Amber, bright amber, like honey held up to sunlight, like the first flames of a fire catching kindling. Dominic stopped breathing. 12 years fell away in an instant. He was 24 again, lying on a bed in a small cabin, fever burning through his body, 3 stab wounds still seeping blood through their bandages. An old woman sat beside him, changing his dressings, humming a soft melody, and in her arms, a baby. A tiny infant with a tuft of dark hair and eyes that seemed too large for her face, amber eyes that had watched him through his delirium, eyes that had never cried when he screamed in the night, eyes that the old woman had held close to him on his last morning in that cabin, saying, "She's been watching over you. Babies know souls. Maybe you're not as bad as you think." Dominic stood frozen before the rusted door, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. It was her. The baby had become a child, and someone had put her in a cage. When he spoke, his voice did not sound like his own. It was colder than the winter night, harder than the iron chain, more dangerous than anything Derek Briggs had ever heard in his miserable life. "Break the lock. Now." Jonas moved instantly, producing a bolt cutter from one of the other men. The chain fell away with a metallic shriek. The door swung open, its rusted hinges groaning in protest. Light flooded the shed. Lily Thornton sat exactly where she had been, her doll clutched to her chest, her amber eyes blinking against the sudden brightness. She did not scream. She did not run. She did not cry. She simply looked up at the tall man standing in the doorway, this stranger, made of shadows and silence, and asked in a voice hoarse from cold and disuse, "Are you going to hurt me too?" Dominic Vale had never knelt before anyone in his life. Not before the men who had tried to kill him. Not before the judges who had tried to imprison him. Not before the rivals who had tried to buy him. He had built his empire on the understanding that he bowed to no one, bent for nothing, and answered only to himself. But now, in the doorway of a rotting shed in rural Oregon, he lowered himself to his knees. The frozen ground bit through his expensive trousers. The cold seeped into his bones. He did not notice. His entire world had narrowed to a single point, a pair of amber eyes staring back at him from the darkness. "No one is going to hurt you." The words came out softer than he intended, softer than he knew he was capable of speaking. Not anymore. Lily did not move. She watched him with the stillness of a rabbit caught in headlights, waiting to see if this new predator would strike. But there was something strange in her expression, something that twisted in Dominic's chest like a knife. She was not afraid, not because she was brave, not because she trusted him, but because she had been afraid for so long, had lived in fear for so many months. That fear had become as natural as breathing. It no longer registered as an emotion. It was simply the baseline of her existence. Dominic had seen that look before, in the eyes of men who had been broken in prison, in the faces of soldiers who had seen too much death. Never in the face of a child. Never in the face of a 7-year-old girl. Lily shifted slightly, adjusting her grip on her doll, and her sleeve rode up her thin arm. Dominic's gaze dropped to the exposed skin. Bruises, purple and green and yellow, layered like a map of suffering, some fresh and some fading, the unmistakable marks of fingers gripping too hard, of hands striking soft flesh. Lily saw him looking. Without a word, without even a change in expression, she pulled her sleeve back down, covering the evidence. The motion was practiced, automatic. The reflex of a child who had learned that showing her wounds only brought more pain. Something cracked inside Dominic's chest. Something he had thought died long ago. He shrugged off his coat, the black wool that cost more than most people earned in a month, and he wrapped it around Lily's tiny frame. The fabric swallowed her whole, falling past her feet, pooling on the dirty floor of the shed. Lily gasped. It was a small sound, barely audible, but it cut through Dominic like a blade. She was gasping because the coat was warm, because she had not felt warmth in so long that she had forgotten what it meant. "I'm going to pick you up now," Dominic said quietly. "Is that okay?" Lily considered the question with the gravity of someone much older. Then she gave a tiny nod. Dominic slid his arms beneath her and lifted. She weighed nothing. He had prepared himself for the weight of a 7-year-old child, had braced his muscles accordingly, and instead he found himself holding something that felt hollow, fragile, like a bird made of paper and wishes and not nearly enough food. His jaw tightened until pain shot through his teeth. Lily's arms remained wrapped around her doll, pressed between her chest and his. She did not reach for him. She did not cling. She simply allowed herself to be carried, the way she had learned to allow so many things, because resistance only made everything worse. Jonas fell into step beside them as Dominic carried Lily toward the front of the house. The older man glanced at the child's face, at the shape of her features, at the particular shade of her eyes. "She looks just like Mrs. Thornton," he murmured. "Same eyes, same jaw, like a photograph come to life." Dominic did not respond. He could not. His throat had closed around something sharp and immovable, something that tasted like rage and grief and the bitter weight of 12 years too late. Lily looked up at the stranger who held her. She studied his face, his gray eyes, the hard line of his mouth. She did not know who he was. She did not know why he had come. She did not know what would happen next. But wrapped in his coat, held in his arms, carried away from the shed that had been her prison, Lily Thornton felt something she had forgotten existed. For the first time in 6 months, she felt safe. Dominic carried Lily across the frozen yard, his men parting before him like water before the prow of a ship. The child in his arms had gone still, her face pressed against his shoulder, her thin fingers clutching her doll so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Derek and Sharon Briggs stood on the porch, watching. Derek's beer bottle hung forgotten at his side, dripping amber liquid onto the rotting wood. Sharon's hands twisted the belt of her bathrobe over and over, her eyes darting between Dominic and the black SUVs, and the men in dark suits who surrounded her home. "Now wait just a minute." Derek's voice cracked as he stumbled down the porch steps. The alcohol in his blood gave him courage that his sober mind would never have allowed. "That's my niece. You can't just walk in here and take her. I have legal custody." Dominic stopped walking. The night seemed to grow colder. The wind died. Even the distant sounds of the highway faded into nothing, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Slowly, deliberately, Dominic turned his head. He did not turn his body. He did not shift his grip on Lily. He simply turned his head and looked at Derek Briggs with eyes that had watched men die, eyes that had ordered executions, eyes that had stared into the abyss so many times that the abyss had learned to look away first. Derek's next words died in his throat. His feet stopped moving. His bladder loosened slightly, though he would deny it later. "You locked a 7-year-old in a shed." Dominic's voice was low, quiet, more terrifying than any shout could ever be. "In winter, in 5 degrees below zero. With no blanket, no food, no heat." Each sentence fell like a hammer blow. "You call that custody?" Sharon rushed down the steps, positioning herself slightly behind her husband, using him as a shield, her face contorted with self-righteous indignation, the expression of a woman who had spent her whole life believing she was always right. "She's a problem child." Sharon's voice rose to a shrill pitch. "She lies. She steals. She breaks things. We took her in out of the goodness of our hearts, and this is how she repays us. You don't know what we've had to deal with." A small voice cut through the night air. "I didn't steal." Everyone froze. Lily had lifted her head from Dominic's shoulder. Her amber eyes were fixed on Sharon. And despite the cold, despite the fear, despite everything this woman had done to her, there was something in her gaze that refused to break. "I didn't steal," she repeated, her voice hoarse but steady. "Kyle took Grandma's necklace. The one with the purple flower. He took it from my hiding place." She paused, and her next words carried the weight of 6 months of silent suffering. "And you sold it. At the pawn shop on Miller Street. I heard you tell Uncle Derek it got you $80. Silence fell like a guillotine blade. Sharon's face went white. Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Behind them, in the doorway of the house, a figure appeared. Kyle Briggs, 14 years old, stared out at the scene before him. His video game controller was still clutched in his hands. His face had drained of all color, pale as chalk in the porch light. Dominic looked at Lily. Something shifted in his expression. Something that might have been respect, might have been grief, might have been the first stirrings of a bond that would change both their lives forever. Then he looked back at the Briggs family. Jonas. His voice carried easily across the yard. "Get everything, every record of what they did to this child. Medical reports, school records, financial statements, and her grandmother's belongings." His gray eyes locked onto Sharon. "All of them." Jonas nodded and gestured to 2 of the men. They moved toward the house with purpose. Derek started to protest, but one look from Jonas silenced him. Dominic resumed walking toward the lead SUV. One of his men opened the rear door, and Dominic climbed inside, still cradling Lily against his chest. Just before the door closed, he spoke again. His voice drifted across the frozen night, calm and conversational, as if discussing the weather. "Pray I don't find anything worse." He still did not turn around, still did not look at the trembling couple on the porch, because some debts I collect in money, some debts I collect in pain. A pause. The wind picked up, howling through the bare trees. "And some debts I collect in blood." The door closed with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than thunder. The SUV hummed through the Oregon night, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin blades. Lily had fallen asleep against Dominic's chest, her small body exhausted beyond measure, her breath coming in slow, shallow waves. Dominic looked down at her face, peaceful now in sleep, and the years fell away like leaves from a dying tree, 12 winters ago. The same Oregon forest, a different kind of cold. He had been 24 years old then, young, hungry, stupid enough to trust the wrong people. He had been climbing the ranks of an organization that dealt in things best left unspoken, and he had been good at it, too good. Good enough to make powerful men nervous. The ambush came on a night much like this one. 3 men he had called brothers. 3 knives that found his flesh before he even knew he was dying. 2 wounds to the stomach, 1 to the back, just missing his spine by the width of a finger. They left him in the forest, bleeding into the snow, too far from any road for anyone to find him. They assumed the cold would finish what their blades had started. They assumed wrong. Dominic crawled, through snow that reached his elbows, through undergrowth that tore at his wounds, through pain so absolute it became meaningless, just another sensation to be ignored on the way to survival. He crawled for hours. His blood froze on his skin, forming a grotesque shell of ice and crimson. His fingers went numb, then his hands, then his arms. His vision blurred, his thoughts scattered like startled birds. But still he crawled, because Dominic Vale had learned, long before that night, that dying was easy. Living was the hard part, and he had never chosen easy. Dawn was breaking when he finally collapsed. His body had given everything it had, and there was simply nothing left. He lay face down in the snow, feeling the cold seep into his bones, watching his breath form weaker and weaker clouds in the gray morning light. This is it, he thought. This is where it ends. Then he heard a door creak open, footsteps crunching through snow, a gasp, and then a voice, weathered by age, but strong with purpose. "Lord have mercy." Hands gripped his shoulders, surprisingly strong for their age. A face appeared above him, framed by silver hair and lit by eyes that held no fear, only compassion. Margaret Thornton was 60 years old that winter. She had lived alone in her cabin since her husband passed, tending her garden, sewing quilts, raising the infant granddaughter whose parents traveled too much for work. She had seen hard men before. Her father had been one. Her husband had been one. She recognized the look in Dominic's eyes, the mark of violence that clung to him like a second skin. She saved him anyway. "Help me get him inside, Lord," she muttered as she gripped his arm, beginning the impossible task of dragging a full-grown man across her threshold. In her other arm, secured in a cloth sling against her chest, a baby slept peacefully. Even wolves deserve mercy in winter. It took her nearly 20 minutes to pull him into the cabin, leaving a trail of blood across her clean wooden floors. She did not complain. She did not hesitate. She simply did what needed to be done, the way she had done everything in her life. Dominic faded in and out of consciousness. He remembered flashes, the warmth of a fire, the sting of alcohol on his wounds, the soft humming of an old hymn, and pain. Endless, searing pain that meant he was still alive. Night fell again. Fever took hold, dragging him into delirium. He thrashed, he screamed, he begged for death in languages he did not remember learning. And then, in one moment of terrible clarity, he opened his eyes. The cabin was quiet. Firelight danced across the ceiling, casting shadows that swayed like gentle ghosts. Somewhere nearby, the old woman hummed softly as she worked, but that was not what held Dominic's attention. A cradle sat beside his bed, and in that cradle, a baby lay awake, her tiny head turned toward him, her eyes open and watching. Amber eyes, bright as honey, clear as autumn sunlight. She did not cry. She did not fuss. She simply watched him, this dying stranger in her grandmother's home, with an expression of pure curiosity. No fear, no judgment, just innocent wonder at the bleeding man who had stumbled into her world. Dominic stared back at those amber eyes, and something shifted in his chest, something he would not understand for another 12 years. Something that felt almost like hope, Margaret Thornton had not held a needle to human flesh in over 30 years, but some skills, once learned in blood and fire, never truly fade. She had been 22 when she volunteered as a combat nurse in Vietnam. She had seen boys younger than her own son torn apart by shrapnel. She had held men's intestines in her hands while surgeons worked frantically to save them. She had learned to sew skin back together with whatever was available, to stop bleeding with herbs and pressure and sheer stubborn will. Now, in her small cabin in the Oregon woods, those old lessons came flooding back. The stranger's wounds were severe. The stab to his back had missed his spine but had nicked something important, judging by the dark blood that seeped from it. The 2 wounds to his stomach were deep, ragged, made by someone who had wanted him to suffer before he died. Maggie worked through the night. She cleaned the wounds with whiskey, ignoring the stranger's delirious screams. She threaded her sewing needle with the strongest thread she had, the kind she used for quilting, and she stitched his torn flesh together with the same careful attention she gave her embroidery. She packed the wounds with yarrow and plantain from her garden, herbs her grandmother had taught her to use for drawing out infection. The stranger fought her. He thrashed and cursed and called out names she did not recognize. His fever spiked so high that his skin burned to the touch, and his sweat soaked through the sheets as fast as she could change them. 5 days. For 5 days, Margaret Thornton did not sleep more than an hour at a time. She changed his bandages. She forced water between his cracked lips. She bathed his burning forehead with cool cloths. She prayed, though she was not certain anymore if anyone was listening. She did not call the police. She had known men like this before. Hard men, dangerous men whose presence brought attention that simple people like her could not afford. The police would ask questions. They would dig into her life, into her son's life, into the granddaughter she was raising, while her son and daughter-in-law worked overseas. Nothing good would come of it. So she told no one, and she kept working. The deepest wound, the one in his stomach that would not stop bleeding, required something more than thread. Maggie searched her sewing basket and found her grandmother's handkerchief, white linen embroidered with tiny violet flowers, the letter M stitched delicately in one corner. She folded it carefully and pressed it against the wound, binding it in place with strips of clean cloth. The bleeding finally stopped. Through it all, baby Lily watched from her cradle. Her amber eyes followed every movement, every gesture, as if she understood somehow that something important was happening. She rarely cried during those 5 days, only fussing when she was hungry or needed changing. The rest of the time, she simply watched. On the 6th morning, the fever broke. Dominic opened his eyes to find himself in a strange bed, in a strange cabin, with sunlight streaming through windows framed by hand-sewn curtains. His body felt like it had been dragged behind a truck for miles. Every breath brought pain, every movement brought more, but he was alive. The old woman sat in a chair beside him, her silver hair pulled back in a simple braid, her hands busy with some kind of needlework. She looked up when she heard him stir, and her weathered face creased into a gentle smile. "Back from the dead," she said softly. "I was starting to wonder." Dominic tried to speak, but his throat was raw from days of screaming. He managed only a rasping whisper. "Why did you save me? You don't know who I am." Maggie set down her embroidery and looked at him with eyes that had seen too much to be frightened by anything anymore. "I don't need to know who you are," she said simply. "I only need to know you're alive, and that's enough reason to keep you that way." Dominic stared at her. In all his years of violence and betrayal, he had never encountered anything like this. Kindness without motive, mercy without price. He did not know what to do with it. Maggie seemed to sense his confusion. She smiled again, softer this time, and nodded toward the cradle beside the bed. "See that child? She watched over you every night, never cried once when you screamed, just watched with those big eyes of hers." Dominic turned his head. The baby with the amber eyes was awake, staring at him again with that same expression of innocent curiosity. "Babies know souls," Maggie continued, her voice warm as a hearth fire. "They can sense things we've forgotten how to feel. She wouldn't cry when near you, wouldn't fuss, just watched over you like a little guardian angel." She reached over and patted his hand, her touch gentle as a mother's. "Maybe you're not as bad as you think." 2 weeks passed in the small cabin at the edge of the forest. Dominic grew stronger each day, his wounds knitting together under Maggie's careful attention, his body slowly remembering how to function without screaming in protest. He ate her simple food. He slept in her clean sheets. He watched her go about her daily routines with a quiet efficiency that spoke of a lifetime of self-reliance. And he watched the baby. Lily was 5 months old now, growing plumper by the week, her amber eyes following everything with endless fascination. She had started to smile, a gummy, toothless grin that transformed her entire face. She smiled at her grandmother. She smiled at the fire. She smiled at the dancing dust motes in the sunlight. She smiled at Dominic. Every time she did, something twisted in his chest, something uncomfortable and unfamiliar. On the morning of the 15th day, Dominic rose before dawn. His wounds still ached, but he could move without gasping, could breathe without wincing. It was time to go. He found Maggie in the kitchen, already awake, heating water for tea. She looked at him standing in the doorway with his coat on and his boots laced, and her weathered face showed no surprise. "Leaving, then," she said. "It was not a question. I have to," she nodded, as if she had expected nothing else. "There's bread in the cupboard. Take what you need for the road." Dominic reached into his pocket and withdrew a thick envelope. He had found it in his coat before they had dumped him in the forest. Money he had been carrying for a deal that never happened. Thousands of dollars in cash. He set it on the table. "For your trouble." Maggie looked at the envelope, then looked at him. Without a word, she pushed it back across the table. "I didn't save you for money," she said simply. "I saved you because it was the right thing to do. You keep that. You'll need it more than I will." Dominic stared at her. In his world, everything had a price. Every favor demanded repayment. Every kindness came with strings attached. But not here. Not with this woman. "At least tell me your name," he said quietly. "Let me repay you someday." Maggie smiled, the same gentle smile she had worn throughout his recovery. "Margaret Thornton. But don't come back looking for debts, young man. Just live well. That's enough repayment." She picked up the envelope and pressed it firmly into his hands, closing his fingers around it. "Live well," she repeated. "That's all I ask." Dominic looked toward the corner where Lily lay in her cradle, awake and watching him with those impossible amber eyes. As if sensing his attention, she raised one tiny hand and waved it in the air, a random infant gesture that somehow felt like farewell. Something caught in Dominic's throat. He noticed the handkerchief still pressed against his stomach beneath his shirt, the white linen now stained with his blood, the violet flowers barely visible beneath the rust-colored marks. "The handkerchief," he said. "I should return it." Maggie shook her head. "Keep it. Let it remind you that kindness exists, even for wolves in winter." Dominic held her gaze for a long moment. Then, without another word, he walked out the door and into the gray morning mist. He did not look back. He could not. If he looked back, he might never leave. The forest swallowed him whole, and Margaret Thornton returned to her tea, her embroidery, her granddaughter with the amber eyes. 12 years passed. Dominic built his empire from blood and ashes. He became the name that powerful men whispered in fear. He accumulated more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, more power than most politicians could dream of. And through it all, he kept the handkerchief. It lived in his desk drawer, carefully preserved, taken out only on nights when the darkness pressed too close. He would hold it in his hands and remember the smell of wood smoke, the taste of simple bread, the warmth of a fire built by someone who expected nothing in return. He sent men to find Margaret Thornton, but she had moved after her son and daughter-in-law died in a car accident, taking her orphaned granddaughter somewhere unknown. The trail went cold. Years passed. Other matters demanded attention. Then, 6 months ago, Jonas finally found her. He walked into Dominic's office with a file in his hands and an expression that warned of bad news. "Margaret Thornton," Jonas said. "We found her. Small town called Millbrook, about 3 hours from where you met her." Dominic sat forward, something lifting in his chest for the first time in years. "But boss," Jonas hesitated. "She died 6 months ago. Cancer." The silence that followed was absolute. Dominic sat motionless, the news settling into his bones like ice. 12 years of searching, and he had arrived 6 months too late. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "The child, the baby with amber eyes." He looked up at Jonas, and something desperate flickered in his gray gaze. "Where is she?" Jonas opened the file. "Her name is Lily Thornton, 7 years old. After Mrs. Thornton died, she was placed with her closest living relatives." He paused. "A couple named Briggs. Derek and Sharon Briggs." And that was how Dominic Vale found himself standing in the frozen yard of a rundown house in rural Oregon, staring at a rusted shed where a child with amber eyes had been locked away like an animal. The debt was 12 years old, but some debts never expire. The SUV moved through the Oregon night like a shadow, its headlights carving a path through the darkness toward Seattle. Inside, the heater hummed softly, filling the cabin with warmth that Lily Thornton had almost forgotten existed. She sat in the back seat, still wrapped in Dominic's coat, her doll clutched against her chest. Her amber eyes stared at nothing, unfocused, distant, as if her mind had retreated to somewhere far away where pain could not follow. Dominic sat across from her, his gray eyes never leaving her face. He did not speak. He did not ask questions. He simply waited, the way a hunter waits for prey to emerge from hiding, the way a river waits for ice to melt. Miles passed in silence. Then, without warning, Lily spoke. Aunt Sharon said Grandma died because of me. Her voice was flat, emotionless, the voice of a child reading words from a page rather than speaking from her heart. Dominic recognized that tone. He had heard it from men who had been broken in prison, from soldiers who had seen too much death, the voice of someone who had learned to disconnect from their own suffering. She said, "I'm bad luck," Lily continued, her eyes still fixed on nothing. She said, "Everyone who loves me dies. First my parents, then Grandma." She said, "I'm cursed." Dominic's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "Uncle Derek hits when he's drunk." Lily's tone did not change. She might have been discussing the weather. "He's drunk every night. Sometimes he uses his hand, sometimes his belt. Once he used the wooden spoon from the kitchen. It broke." The coat rustled as Lily shifted slightly. Her small hand emerged from the folds of fabric, still holding her doll. "Kyle broke my fingers once." Dominic's gaze dropped to her hands. Her left pinky finger curved at an unnatural angle, the bone clearly healed wrong, set by no doctor, treated by no one who cared. "He said it was an accident," Lily said. "He grabbed my hand and bent my finger back until it snapped. Then he told Aunt Sharon I fell. They believed him. They always believed him." She tucked her hand back under the coat, hiding the evidence of cruelty as naturally as breathing. "I wake up at 5 every morning. I clean the kitchen. I wash the dishes. I sweep the floors. I make their breakfast. Then Kyle and Aunt Sharon eat. Then Uncle Derek eats. Then, if there's anything left, I can have some." Her voice remained perfectly level, perfectly calm, perfectly devastating. "If I make a mistake, I sleep in the shed. Mistakes are things like looking at Uncle Derek too long, or not smiling when guests come over, or crying because I miss Grandma." She paused, and for the first time, something flickered in her amber eyes, something ancient and tired, and far too heavy for a 7-year-old to carry. "I stopped crying after the first month. Crying made them angrier, so I stopped." The silence that followed was absolute. Dominic sat motionless, his face carved from stone, his body perfectly still, but his hands had curled into fists at his sides, the knuckles turning white as bone, the tendons standing out like cables beneath his skin. He had killed men before, many men. Some had deserved it, some had simply been in the way. He had ended lives for money, for power, for territory, for revenge. He had never lost sleep over any of them, but this was different. For the first time in his 36 years of life, Dominic Vale wanted to kill someone not for profit, not for protection, not for any strategic advantage. He wanted to kill Derek and Sharon Briggs because they had taken a child with amber eyes, a child who had watched over him through fever dreams and never cried, a child whose grandmother had saved his worthless life with nothing but kindness and thread. They had taken that child and taught her that crying brought pain. They had broken her fingers and starved her body and locked her in a frozen shed until she learned to count cracks in the wall instead of hoping for rescue. They had taught a 7-year-old girl to forget how to cry. Dominic looked at Lily, at her hollow cheeks and her haunted eyes, and her small body drowning in his coat, and he made a silent vow. Whatever it took, however long it required, whatever laws he had to bend or break, he would make them pay. The elevator opened onto the top floor of the Seattle high-rise, revealing a penthouse that sprawled across 3,000 square feet of polished marble and floor-to-ceiling windows. The city glittered below like a carpet of fallen stars, and the space itself spoke of money beyond measure, of power beyond question. Dominic stepped out, expecting Lily to follow. She did not. He turned to find her standing at the threshold, her small body frozen in place, her amber eyes wide as they swept across the vast interior. The gleaming floors, the leather furniture, the kitchen that shone like a showroom, the fireplace crackling with carefully arranged logs. She was trembling. "What's wrong?" Dominic asked, his brow furrowing. Lily did not answer immediately. Her gaze dropped to the floor, to the pristine marble that reflected the overhead lights like a mirror, to the complete absence of dust or dirt or any imperfection. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "If I make it dirty, will you lock me outside too?" The question hit Dominic like a physical blow. He looked at the penthouse through her eyes and understood. The spotless floors she would be punished for scuffing, The white furniture she would be beaten for staining. The perfect order she would be locked in a shed for disturbing. To him, this was simply where he lived. To her, it was a minefield of potential mistakes. Dominic crossed the distance between them and lowered himself to his knees, bringing his eyes level with hers. He had faced down crime bosses and corrupt politicians and men who wanted him dead. None of them had made him feel as helpless as this 7-year-old girl staring at him with eyes that expected nothing but pain. "This is your home now," he said quietly. "You can't make anything wrong here. Do you understand? There are no mistakes in this place. Not for you." Lily looked at him with an expression that broke something inside his chest. She did not believe him. She wanted to. He could see it in the flicker of hope that crossed her features before she suppressed it. But she had learned too well that promises were made to be broken, that adults lied, that kindness was just the prelude to cruelty. She stepped inside anyway, because she had also learned that resistance only made things worse. Dominic set her up in the warmest room of the penthouse, a guest suite with a soft bed and thick blankets and a window that looked out over the twinkling city. He brought her warm milk and a sandwich and sat with her while she ate, watching as she consumed every bite with the desperate efficiency of someone who never knew when food would be offered again. When her eyes began to droop, he left her to sleep. 3 hours later, he woke to silence. Something felt wrong. He could not explain it, but his instincts, honed by years of survival, screamed at him to check. He rose from his bed and padded down the hallway to the guest room. The bed was empty. Panic seized his throat before he could stop it. He searched the bathroom, the closet, under the bed. Nothing. He found her in the living room. Lily had wedged herself into the corner near the front door, her back pressed against the wall, her doll clutched to her chest. She was curled into the smallest possible shape, her eyes open and staring at the entrance. "Lily," his voice came out rougher than he intended. "What are you doing?" She looked up at him, and her answer was delivered in that same flat tone that haunted him. "The bed is too soft. I can't hear if someone's coming." Dominic stood frozen in the dim light of the penthouse, watching a child who had learned to sleep by the door so she could hear approaching footsteps. A child who found danger in softness and threat in comfort. He did not know what to say, so he said nothing. Instead, he walked to the corner, lowered himself to the floor, and sat down a few feet away from her, close enough to be present, far enough not to crowd. Lily watched him with wary eyes. Dominic leaned his head back against the wall and closed his own. They stayed like that until morning. A child who was afraid of soft beds. A mafia boss who did not know how to make a little girl trust him. Neither of them slept, but neither of them was alone. 3 days after Lily arrived at the penthouse, Jonas Mercer walked into Dominic's office with a thick folder tucked under his arm and an expression that warned of darkness ahead. Dominic sat behind his desk, the Seattle skyline glittering behind him through walls of glass. He had not slept more than a few hours since bringing Lily home. Every night, he found her in a different corner, a different shadow, never on the bed, always near a door or window. "The report on the Briggs family," Jonas said, laying the folder on the desk. "It's worse than we thought, boss. Much worse." Dominic opened the folder. The first page was a financial summary. Derek and Sharon Briggs had applied for custody of Lily Thornton within 2 weeks of Margaret Thornton's death. Not out of love, not out of family obligation, but because Maggie had left a modest inheritance for her granddaughter, along with monthly survivor benefits from the state. They had drained almost everything. The house Maggie had owned, sold for half its value. The savings account she had built over decades, emptied within 3 months. The antique furniture she had treasured, pawned piece by piece. And the necklace. Dominic's hand paused over a photograph. A delicate silver chain with a violet flower pendant, the same design that was embroidered on the handkerchief he had kept for 12 years. Maggie's necklace, the one Lily had mentioned, sold to a pawn shop on Miller Street for $80. He turned the page. Medical records. 8 emergency room visits in 6 months. Lily Thornton, age 7. Presenting with various injuries attributed to falls, accidents, clumsiness, a broken rib, not fully healed, a burn mark on her forearm, consistent with the shape of a clothes iron, multiple contusions in various stages of healing, severe malnutrition, weight significantly below normal for her age. The attending physicians had noted their suspicions, but without proof, without Lily speaking up, without anyone willing to investigate further, the file had simply grown thicker while the abuse continued. Dominic stared at a photograph of Lily taken during one of those visits. Her face was bruised. Her eyes were empty. She looked like a ghost wearing the skin of a child. He turned another page. Derek Briggs had gambling debts totaling over $40,000. He owed money to loan sharks, to casinos, to men who broke kneecaps for a living. The monthly benefits meant for Lily's care had gone directly to paying those debts, keeping Derek one step ahead of collectors who would have otherwise made him very uncomfortable. Lily had been starving so Derek could gamble. Lily had been freezing so Sharon could buy new clothes. Lily had been beaten so Kyle could have video games and takeout dinners. Dominic closed the folder. The silence in the office was absolute. Jonas stood perfectly still, watching his boss with the wariness of a man who knew what Dominic Vale was capable of when pushed too far. But Dominic did not explode. He did not slam his fist on the desk or hurl objects across the room or issue orders for blood and broken bones. Instead, he went quiet. Utterly, terrifyingly quiet. The kind of quiet that came before earthquakes, before tsunamis, before the world itself cracked open. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, more dangerous than any shout. I want them destroyed. Legally. He looked up at Jonas with eyes like frozen steel. I want them to suffer the way the law allows. I want every record exposed, every crime documented, every debt called in. I want their names to become synonymous with shame. He paused. And then we'll see. Jonas nodded slowly. And if the law isn't enough? Dominic reached into his desk drawer and withdrew something small, something worn by time. The handkerchief. White linen, yellowed with age, stained with blood that had long since turned brown, embroidered with tiny violet flowers, and the letter M in one corner. He held it in his hands, looking at it the way a man might look at a holy relic. Mrs. Thornton saved me because she believed she could save a soul, he said quietly. She looked at a dying criminal and saw something worth keeping alive. She gave me mercy when I deserved none. He folded the handkerchief carefully and placed it back in the drawer. I won't disappoint her by killing them like animals. I'll destroy them like a man. Through the courts, through the law, through every legitimate channel available. His gray eyes met Jonas's. But make no mistake. They will pay for every bruise, every broken bone, every night she spent in that shed. They will pay until there is nothing left of them but regret. 2 weeks passed in the Seattle penthouse. Lily still slept on the floor, but now she slept in her own room, curled in the corner with her doll. A blanket pulled from the bed wrapped around her small body. It was not much, but it was something. Dominic had hired Dr. Evelyn Park on the 3rd day. She was a child psychologist with 20 years of experience treating trauma survivors. A quiet woman with gentle eyes and a voice that never rose above a calm, steady tone. She came to the penthouse every afternoon, spending an hour with Lily while Dominic waited in his office, pretending to work, but hearing nothing except the soft murmur of voices down the hall. After her 5th visit, Dr. Park asked to speak with him privately. She's dissociating, the doctor explained, her hands folded in her lap. Her emotions are locked away as a survival mechanism. It's common in children who have experienced prolonged abuse. The mind protects itself by shutting down. Dominic stared at his desk. How long until she recovers? Dr. Park was silent for a moment. Months, maybe years. There's no timeline for healing, Mr. Vale. There's only patience, consistency, and safety. You give her those things, and eventually, she'll find her way back. Patience, consistency, safety. 3 things Dominic had never offered anyone in his life. He learned to offer them now. The progress came in increments so small they were almost invisible. On the 4th day, Lily began eating at the table instead of carrying her plate to the corner of the room. On the 7th day, she stopped flinching when doors closed too loudly. On the 10th day, Jonas dropped a coffee mug, and instead of freezing in terror, Lily watched the dark liquid splash across his pristine white shirt, and she laughed. It was a small sound, barely more than a breath, but it filled the room like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Jonas stood there, coffee dripping from his sleeve, staring at the child who had just made a sound he had never heard from her before. Dominic, watching from the doorway, felt something crack in his chest. He tried to learn how to care for a child. He failed spectacularly. The first clothes he bought were 3 sizes too large, drowning Lily in fabric that made her look even smaller than she was. He returned them and bought clothes that were 2 sizes too small. On the 3rd attempt, he brought Jonas, who had 3 younger sisters and actually understood how children's sizing worked. He tried to cook. The oatmeal burned so badly the pan had to be thrown away. The scrambled eggs came out rubbery and gray. The toast caught fire, setting off the smoke alarm and sending Lily diving under the kitchen table. He could not braid hair. He watched 17 tutorial videos and still produced something that looked more like a bird's nest than a hairstyle. Lily sat patiently through his attempts, never complaining, never laughing, just watching him in the mirror with those amber eyes that seemed to see everything. One morning, after his 5th failed attempt at a simple ponytail, Dominic threw the hairbrush onto the counter in frustration. "I'm sorry," he said, the words coming out rougher than intended. "I don't know what I'm doing." Lily looked up at him. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she spoke. "It's okay." Her voice was soft as moth wings. Grandma said, "Trying is what matters." Dominic froze. It was the first time she had volunteered words without being asked a direct question. The first time she had offered comfort instead of simply receiving it. He knelt down beside her, meeting her amber eyes. "Your grandma was a very wise woman," he said. Lily nodded. "I know." That night, Dominic walked past Lily's room on his way to bed. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, he could hear something that stopped him in his tracks. Singing. Lily's voice, thin and wavering but unmistakably real, drifted through the crack. She was singing to her doll, a lullaby in a language that was half melody and half memory, the same song Maggie had hummed while stitching his wounds 12 years ago. Dominic stood outside the door, his hand pressed against the frame, his eyes closed, listening. He had built an empire on fear and blood. He had commanded armies of men who would kill at his word. He had accumulated power that made governors nervous and senators polite. None of it mattered. For the first time in his life, Dominic Vale wanted to protect something more than himself, more than his money, more than his kingdom. He wanted to protect a 7-year-old girl who sang lullabies to her doll in the darkness, and he would burn the world to ashes before he let anyone hurt her again. Jonas walked into Dominic's office on a Tuesday morning, carrying a small velvet box in his weathered hands. His face wore an expression Dominic had rarely seen in their 15 years together. "Hope. We found it, boss." Dominic looked up from the legal documents spread across his desk, papers detailing the mounting case against Derek and Sharon Briggs. "Found what?" Jonas set the box down gently, as if it contained something infinitely precious. "The necklace. Mrs. Thornton's necklace. The one with the violet pendant." Dominic's hand froze over the papers. "It wasn't easy," Jonas continued. "Sharon Briggs sold it to a pawn shop on Miller Street. They sold it to another shop in Portland. That shop sold it to a dealer in antique jewelry. The dealer sold it to a collector in San Francisco." He paused. It took some convincing, but he agreed to part with it. Dominic opened the box. The silver chain lay coiled on a bed of black velvet, delicate as spun moonlight. The pendant was exactly as he remembered from the photograph. A single violet flower crafted with exquisite detail, each petal perfect, each curve catching the light. "How much?" Dominic asked quietly. He wanted 4,000. "I paid 20. Dominic nodded. 20 times the value Sharon Briggs had received for $80 of gambling money. 20 times the worth of a grandmother's love reduced to pocket change. It was still not enough. He found Lily in the living room, sitting at the coffee table with crayons scattered around her. She was drawing something, her small hand moving across the paper with careful concentration. When Dominic approached, she looked up with those amber eyes that still held too much caution for a child her age. "I have something for you," he said. He sat down across from her and placed the velvet box on the table between them. Lily stared at it, her crayon frozen in midair, her expression unreadable. "Open it." Her hands trembled as she reached for the box. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp. The lid swung open, and the violet pendant caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Lily went completely still. For a long moment, she did not move, did not breathe, did not blink. Then the tears came. They fell silently, streaming down her hollow cheeks without a sound, dripping onto the table and her drawing and her small clenched hands. She cried the way she had learned to cry, the way the Briggs family had taught her to cry, without noise, without sobs, without any indication that might bring punishment. Silent tears from a child who had been broken of the right to weep aloud. Dominic did not know what to do. He had faced assassins and betrayers and men who wanted him dead. He had navigated wars between criminal empires and emerged victorious. But watching this small girl cry without sound, watching tears pour from amber eyes that held so much pain, he felt utterly helpless. He sat down beside her on the floor, not touching, not speaking, just present. Lily's small body shook with the force of her silent grief. Then, without warning, she threw herself against him, her thin arms wrapping around his chest, her face pressing into his shirt, her tears soaking through the expensive fabric. She held on to him like he was the only solid thing in a world made of quicksand. "Grandma said," she whispered, her voice breaking on every word, "whoever brings this back to me is an angel." She looked up at him, her amber eyes swimming with tears, and something else, something that looked almost like trust. "Are you my angel?" Dominic opened his mouth to answer. No words came. His throat had closed around something sharp and heavy, something that felt like 12 years of searching and 6 months of failure, and the weight of a debt he could never truly repay. He wrapped his arms around Lily and held her while she cried, his chin resting on top of her head, his eyes staring at nothing. That night, Lily did not sleep on the floor. She climbed into bed, her grandmother's necklace clutched in her hand, and she slept through until morning without waking once. Dominic stood in the doorway, watching her chest rise and fall with peaceful breaths, and understood something he had never understood before. The debt he owed Margaret Thornton was not a burden. It was the reason he had survived, the reason he had built his empire, the reason he had kept searching for 12 long years. It was the reason he was still alive. 1 month after the night of the rescue, Derek Briggs had lost everything. The investigation had moved faster than anyone expected. Child Protective Services had descended on his home within days. Police followed shortly after. The medical records, the financial documents, the testimony from neighbors who had heard screaming but said nothing, all of it painted a picture of horror that even the most sympathetic judge could not ignore. Sharon had fled first. She packed a suitcase while Derek was passed out drunk and disappeared to her sister's house in Nevada, leaving behind divorce papers and a note that blamed him for everything. Kyle had been taken by the state, placed in a juvenile facility pending investigation into his own behavior. Derek sat alone in the ruins of his life, surrounded by empty bottles and unpaid bills, and the ghosts of every bad decision he had ever made. The loan sharks came next. Without the monthly benefits from Lily's custody, he had no way to pay his debts. They broke 3 of his fingers as a warning, promised worse if he did not find money soon. And through it all, one thought burned in Derek's alcohol-soaked brain. The girl. The girl was worth money. The girl was his property, and some rich stranger had stolen her. It took 2 weeks and a bribe to a building maintenance worker, but Derek finally discovered where Dominic Vale lived. The penthouse in downtown Seattle, the tower that touched the clouds. He bought a gun from a man who did not ask questions. He waited until night. The security guard at the front desk never saw him coming. Derek moved through the service entrance, taking the freight elevator, his hand wrapped around the pistol in his coat pocket. Whiskey burned in his veins, giving him courage he did not deserve. The penthouse door was locked. He pounded on it with his fist, not caring who heard. "Give me back the kid." His voice echoed through the hallway, slurred and savage. "She's mine. The money is mine. You can't just take what belongs to me." Inside the penthouse, Lily heard that voice. The voice from her nightmares. The voice that had announced beatings and punishments and cold nights in the shed. The voice of every terror she had tried to forget. Her body locked up. Her lungs stopped working. The world narrowed to a single point of absolute fear. She dove under her bed, pressing herself against the wall, her doll crushed to her chest. Her lips moved in a silent prayer, words her grandmother had taught her for moments when the darkness seemed too close. Angels watching over me. Angels keeping me safe. Angels bringing me home. In the hallway, the penthouse door opened. Dominic Vale stepped out. He was not armed. He wore no protective vest. He simply stood there in the corridor, his gray eyes fixed on the drunk, desperate man waving a gun. Derek's hand trembled. The barrel of the pistol swung toward Dominic's chest. "You think you're better than me?" Derek snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "Taking my property? Playing daddy to some worthless brat? Who the hell do you think you are?" Dominic did not answer. He stepped forward. Derek stumbled back, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Stay back! Stay back, or I'll shoot!" Another step forward. "I mean it," Derek's voice cracked. "I'll kill you." Another step. Dominic was close enough now to see the whites of Derek's bloodshot eyes, close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath, close enough to reach out and touch the barrel of the gun pointing at his heart. He did not stop walking. Derek's hand shook so badly the gun rattled. Dominic stopped 3 inches from the muzzle. His gray eyes, cold as glaciers, bored into Derek's soul. "Shoot me." His voice was calm, almost gentle. "Pull the trigger, put a bullet in my chest, and then wait for what comes after." Derek's face twisted with confusion and terror. Dominic leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to fill the entire hallway. "Because I swear on the soul of the woman who saved my life, if you ever touch that child again, it won't be bullets that end you. It will be these hands." He raised them slowly, letting Derek see them. "These hands will tear you apart piece by piece, and I will make it last for days." The gun wavered. Derek's bladder released. and somewhere in the distance, the sound of approaching sirens began to wail. Derek's finger squeezed the trigger. The gunshot exploded through the hallway, deafening in the enclosed space. A crack of thunder that seemed to split the world in two. The bullet went wide. Derek's hand, trembling from alcohol and fear, had jerked at the last moment. The shot buried itself in the wall 3 feet to Dominic's left, sending a spray of plaster dust into the air. Dominic did not flinch. He stood exactly where he had been, gray eyes locked on Derek's face, watching the realization dawn in those bloodshot eyes. The realization that he had missed. The realization that he had just tried to murder a man who had not even blinked. The realization that he was already dead. Before Derek could fire again, Jonas materialized from the stairwell behind him. The older man moved with the efficient brutality of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. One hand seized Derek's wrist, twisting it until the gun clattered to the floor. The other arm wrapped around Derek's throat, cutting off his air, dropping him to his knees in seconds. Derek struggled, but it was like a child fighting against the tide. The elevator doors opened at the end of the hallway. Security guards poured out, followed moments later by police officers responding to the building's silent alarm. The corridor filled with shouting voices, with the crackle of radios, with the chaos of authority arriving too late to prevent what had almost happened. Derek was hauled to his feet, handcuffs snapping around his wrists. He thrashed against the officers holding him, his face purple with rage, his voice rising to a scream that echoed off the walls. "She's just a kid. She's worth money. That's all she is. Why do you care? Why does anyone care about some worthless little?" The officer's hand clamped over his mouth, cutting off the rest. Dominic did not watch them drag Derek away. He had already turned, already moving toward the penthouse door, already focused on the only thing that mattered, Lily. He found her in her bedroom, wedged under the bed, pressed so far back against the wall that she was almost invisible in the shadows. Her doll was crushed against her chest. Her amber eyes stared at nothing, wide and glassy, seeing something that was not there. Shock. Complete dissociative shock. Dr. Park had warned him about this. Trauma responses triggered by reminders of abuse. The mind shutting down to protect itself from memories too painful to bear. Dominic lowered himself to the floor. Slowly. Carefully. He did not reach for her. Did not try to pull her out. He simply lay down on the carpet, his face level with hers, his gray eyes meeting her vacant amber gaze. "Lily." His voice was soft, softer than he had ever spoken to anyone. "He's gone. Derek is gone. The police took him away. He can never hurt you again." No response, just those empty eyes staring through him. Dominic swallowed the lump in his throat. "I promise on your grandmother's name, on Margaret Thornton's name, on the woman who saved my life and asked for nothing in return. He will never touch you again. No one will ever touch you again." Silence stretched between them. Seconds became minutes. Dominic did not move, did not look away. He lay on the floor of a little girl's bedroom, his expensive suit collecting dust, his powerful body still as stone, waiting. Finally, something flickered in Lily's eyes, life returning to a place that had gone dark. Her gaze focused, found his face, held it. She moved. Slowly, inch by inch, she crawled out from under the bed. Her small body trembled. Her fingers clutched her doll so tightly the fabric might tear. She emerged into the dim light of the room and looked at the man lying on the floor, this stranger who had appeared from nowhere and turned her world inside out. Then she crawled into his arms. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply pressed her face against his chest and held on, her small hands gripping his shirt like he was the last solid thing in a collapsing universe. Dominic wrapped his arms around her. He held her the way he imagined fathers held their daughters, the way he had never been held himself. He rose to his feet, lifting her with him, cradling her against his chest like something precious and fragile. And for the first time in his 36 years of life, Dominic Vale understood what it meant to be a father. Not through blood, not through obligation, through choice. 3 months after the night Derek Briggs pulled a trigger and changed nothing. The courtroom in downtown Portland filled with spectators, journalists, and the weight of justice long delayed. Derek sat at the defendant's table, his orange jumpsuit hanging loose on a frame that had lost 30 pounds in county jail. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, his bravado stripped away by months of institutional food and the cold reality of what awaited him. Sharon sat beside him, though she had tried desperately to distance herself from her husband's crimes. Her lawyer had argued she was a victim too, manipulated by an abusive spouse, unaware of the extent of the harm. The prosecution had dismantled that defense with surgical precision. The charges filled 3 pages: child abuse, child neglect, child endangerment, embezzlement of a minor's assets, assault causing bodily harm, theft, fraud, and for Derek alone, attempted murder and assault with a deadly weapon. The evidence was overwhelming. Medical records documented 8 emergency room visits in 6 months. Photographs showed bruises in various stages of healing, a broken rib, burn marks consistent with a clothes iron. Financial statements traced the systematic theft of Lily's inheritance, the sale of her grandmother's possessions, the gambling debts paid with money meant for a child's care. Neighbors testified to hearing screams they had chosen to ignore. Teachers described a student who flinched at sudden movements and never spoke unless spoken to. Doctors admitted they had suspected abuse but lacked the proof to act. And then there was the security footage from the night Derek invaded the penthouse. Crystal clear video of a drunk man waving a gun, screaming about property and money, firing a shot at an unarmed man who had simply stood there and dared him to try again. Kyle Briggs, 14 years old, had already been remanded to juvenile detention. The investigation had revealed his own participation in Lily's torment, the broken fingers he had caused, the daily cruelties he had inflicted with his parents' blessing. He would spend the next 4 years in a facility designed to correct what his upbringing had corrupted. Lily did not appear in court. Dominic had made certain of that. His lawyers had argued successfully that forcing a 7-year-old to testify would cause irreparable psychological harm. Her medical records and documented injuries spoke loudly enough. She did not need to relive her trauma for a jury that had already made up its mind. The verdict came on the 3rd day of trial. Guilty. On all counts. Derek received 15 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 12. Sharon received 8 years, eligible for parole in 5 with good behavior. When the sentence was read, Derek turned in his seat. His eyes found Dominic sitting in the back row of the courtroom, dressed in a dark suit, his face expressionless. Hatred burned in Derek's gaze. Pure, undiluted hatred for the man who had destroyed his life, who had stolen his meal ticket, who had turned a worthless orphan into the instrument of his downfall. Dominic looked back at him. He did not smile, did not gloat, did not offer any reaction at all. He simply watched as the bailiffs led Derek away, as the courtroom doors closed behind him, as justice finally arrived for a little girl who had been failed by everyone meant to protect her. That night, Lily sat on the couch in the penthouse, her grandmother's necklace around her neck, her doll in her lap. The city lights glittered through the windows, a sea of stars that belonged to the earth rather than the sky. "Is it over?" she asked quietly. Dominic sat beside her, maintaining the careful distance she still sometimes needed. "Yes, it's over. They're going to prison. They can never hurt you again." Lily nodded slowly, absorbing this information. Then she looked up at him with those amber eyes that had watched over him 12 years ago, that had witnessed horrors no child should ever see, that still held a question she was afraid to ask. "What happens to me now?" Dominic opened his mouth to answer. Nothing came out. For the first time in his life, he did not have a plan. He had spent months focused on rescue, on recovery, on justice. He had not allowed himself to think beyond the trial, beyond the sentencing, beyond the moment when the immediate danger would pass. What happened now? He did not know. And for once, that uncertainty did not feel like weakness. It felt like possibility. The question hung in the air for days after the trial ended. What happens now? Dominic sat in his office late at night, the Seattle skyline glittering behind him, a glass of whiskey untouched on his desk. He had built an empire from nothing. He had commanded armies of men who feared and respected him. He had navigated wars between criminal organizations and emerged stronger every time. But this decision paralyzed him. He did not know how to be a father. His own father had been a shadow, a man who disappeared before Dominic could form memories of his face. His childhood had been a series of foster homes, group facilities, and streets that taught him survival came at the cost of softness. Everything he knew was violence, power, control, solitude. What did he have to offer a 7-year-old girl who had already seen too much darkness? The thought of sending Lily away, of placing her in another foster home, of watching strangers take her to a life he could not see, could not protect, could not guarantee would be any better than what she had escaped. The thought made him physically ill. Jonas found him there at 2 a.m, staring at the handkerchief spread flat on his desk, the violet flowers faded but still visible in the lamplight. "You're really thinking about this," Jonas said. It was not a question. "Yes." Jonas sat down across from him, studying his boss with the familiarity of 15 years. "You really want to do this? Raise a child? You?" Dominic did not answer immediately. His fingers traced the embroidered M in the corner of the handkerchief, the thread worn thin by 12 years of careful handling. Mrs. Thornton saved me when I was nothing but a bleeding stranger on her doorstep. She didn't ask who I was. She didn't demand anything in return. She just saved me because it was the right thing to do. He looked up at Jonas. I owe her. But more than that. He paused, searching for words that did not come easily. I want this. For Lily. She deserves someone who will fight for her. Someone who will never let anyone hurt her again. The process was neither quick nor simple. Dominic hired the best family law attorneys in the state. He submitted to background checks that made him grateful he had spent the last several years legitimizing his business interests. He opened his home to social workers who documented every room, every safety measure, every indication that this was a suitable environment for a child. His past was scrutinized. His associates were questioned. His finances were examined with microscopic precision. But Dominic had prepared. He had been preparing since the night he found Lily in that shed. Though he had not admitted it to himself, he had withdrawn from activities that could not bear daylight. He had restructured his organizations to remove himself from anything that might raise questions. He had rebuilt himself, piece by piece, into someone worthy of raising Margaret Thornton's granddaughter. The final hearing came on a gray Tuesday morning. Dominic sat in the family court waiting room, dressed in a suit that cost less than his usual wardrobe, but projected more respectability. His hands rested on his knees, perfectly still, betraying none of the turmoil churning beneath his surface. Lily sat beside him, her feet dangling above the floor, her grandmother's necklace visible beneath the collar of her dress. She had been quiet all morning, watching the other families in the waiting room, studying the clerks and lawyers who moved through the hallways. Then her small hand reached over and wrapped around his fingers. I don't care what they decide, she said quietly, her amber eyes finding his. You're already my family. Dominic's throat tightened. He squeezed her hand gently, unable to speak. The clerk called his name. They walked into the courtroom together, hand in hand, and stood before the judge, who held Lily's future in her hands. The hearing lasted 45 minutes. The judge reviewed the documentation, asked questions, listened to the social worker's recommendation. She studied Dominic with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and she studied Lily with compassion that understood everything. Finally, she picked up her pen. The court finds that the petition for legal guardianship is granted. Dominic Vale is hereby appointed as the legal guardian of Lily Rose Thornton, with all rights and responsibilities pertaining thereto. The pen scratched across the paper, the stamp pressed down, and for the first time in 36 years, Dominic Vale had a family. The morning sun streamed through the penthouse windows as Lily Thornton raced through the living room, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, her shoes untied, her hair still damp from the shower. I'm going to be late, she called out, her voice carrying none of the flatness that had once defined it. Dad, where's my lunch? Dominic emerged from the kitchen, a paper bag in one hand, a hairbrush in the other. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, a dish towel thrown over his shoulder, a smear of peanut butter on his otherwise immaculate shirt. Lunch is here. Shoes are untied. Hair is a disaster. Sit. Lily dropped onto the couch with a dramatic sigh that she had learned from the girls at school. Dominic knelt behind her and began brushing, his movements practiced and efficient. 3 months of YouTube tutorials had finally paid off. He could now produce a French braid that would not unravel before lunch. 1 year had passed since the night of the rescue. Lily was 8 now, her frame no longer skeletal, her cheeks no longer hollow, her amber eyes no longer empty. She had grown 3 inches and gained 15 pounds. She laughed easily, spoke freely, and slept through the night in her own bed without waking once. She still kept her grandmother's doll on her pillow, but she no longer clutched it like a lifeline. It was a memento now, a connection to the past, not a shield against the present. She had friends, real friends, not the cautious acquaintances of a child too broken to connect. Girls from her class came over for playdates. Birthday party invitations covered the refrigerator door. Her phone buzzed with messages from classmates coordinating weekend plans. She had a life. The transformation in Dominic was equally profound. The man who had once commanded criminal enterprises now commanded a kitchen with varying degrees of success. He had mastered pancakes but still struggled with omelets. His grilled cheese sandwiches were legendary. His attempts at anything involving a recipe more than 5 steps long remained works in progress. Lily loved every burnt offering. Jonas says you set off the smoke alarm again last night, she giggled as he finished her braid. Jonas talks too much. He says the fire department knows your address by heart. Jonas is exaggerating. He says the most dangerous man in the Pacific Northwest is defeated by a toaster. Dominic gave her braid a gentle tug. School. Now. Jonas drove them, as he did every morning. The old enforcer had become something like an uncle to Lily, a gruff presence who slipped her candy when Dominic was not looking and taught her card games that were probably not appropriate for 8-year-olds. The most feared boss in the Northwest, Jonas remarked as Dominic checked Lily's backpack for the 3rd time. And now his biggest fear is being late for parent-teacher conferences. Dominic shot him a look that would have made grown men flinch. Jonas just smiled. The charity had been Lily's idea. She had been drawing at the kitchen table one evening when she looked up and asked why other kids did not have someone to rescue them like she did. The question had haunted Dominic for days afterward. A month later, Maggie's Light was officially registered as a non-profit organization. Its mission was simple: identify and rescue children in abusive situations, provide them with resources for recovery, and ensure they never fell through the cracks of a system that had failed so many. Lily contributed artwork for the charity's fundraising auctions. Her drawings, bright with color and hope, sold for thousands of dollars to donors who had no idea they were buying pieces of a healing soul. On a quiet evening in early spring, Lily sat on the couch with her homework spread across the coffee table. Dominic sat beside her, reviewing documents for the foundation, the television murmuring softly in the background. Lily set down her pencil and looked at him. "Can I ask you something?" Dominic lowered his papers. "Anything." She hesitated. Her fingers found the violet pendant around her neck, tracing its familiar shape. "Can I call you Dad?" The question hung in the air, simple and profound and terrifying. Dominic sat perfectly still, his throat tightened. His eyes burned with something he refused to name. No one had ever called him that before. No one had ever wanted to. He had spent 36 years certain he would die alone, unmourned, forgotten, and now a little girl with amber eyes was asking permission to make him her father. He nodded. It was all he could manage. Lily smiled, bright as sunrise, and returned to her homework as if she had not just changed everything. "Okay, Dad," she said casually. "Can you help me with this math problem?" Dominic looked at her, at this child who had survived horrors and emerged with her heart intact, at this miracle he did not deserve but would spend the rest of his life protecting. For the first time in his existence, he felt worthy of something. The Oregon countryside rolled past the windows of the SUV, lush and green beneath the spring sky. Wildflowers dotted the meadows like scattered jewels, and the air smelled of pine and fresh rain and memories. Lily sat in the back seat, her face pressed against the glass, watching the landscape she had once called home. In her lap, she held a bouquet of violet flowers, their purple petals bright against the white paper wrapping. Dominic sat beside her, his gray eyes fixed on the road ahead, his thoughts traveling to a time 12 years past, when these same forests had almost become his grave. The cemetery was small and quiet, nestled on a hillside overlooking the valley where Margaret Thornton had spent her final years. Simple headstones marked simple lives, people who had worked the land and raised their families and passed into memory without fanfare. Maggie's grave sat beneath an old oak tree, its branches spreading wide like protective arms. The headstone was modest, just her name and dates, and a small inscription. She lived with kindness. Lily walked ahead, her shoes crunching softly on the gravel path. She knelt before the headstone and laid the violets against the base, arranging them carefully the way her grandmother had taught her to arrange flowers so long ago. For a moment, she simply looked at the name carved in stone. Then she began to talk. "Hi, Grandma." Her voice was soft but steady, carrying easily in the quiet air. "I'm sorry I haven't visited before now. It took a while for things to get better, but they are better now, really better." She traced her grandmother's name with one small finger. "I have a dad now. His name is Dominic. You actually met him once, a long time ago, when I was a baby. He was hurt, and you saved him. He kept your handkerchief all these years. Isn't that funny?" A bird sang somewhere in the branches above, a sweet melody that seemed to underscore her words. "He's not scary like Uncle Derek. I mean, other people think he's scary, but I don't. He makes burnt pancakes almost every weekend, and it took him forever to learn how to braid my hair, but he tries really hard. He always tries." She smiled, a small, private expression meant only for the woman who could no longer see it. "I'm not scared anymore. Well, sometimes I am, when there's a loud noise or when someone yells. But Dad says being scared is okay, as long as you don't let it stop you. He says brave people aren't people who never feel fear. They're people who feel it and keep going anyway." Her hand moved to the pendant around her neck, the silver violet that had once belonged to the woman beneath this stone. "I wear your necklace every day. I won't ever lose it again. I promise." Dominic stood a few paces behind, listening to every word. His chest ached with something he could not name, something that felt like grief and gratitude and love all tangled together. When Lily fell silent, he stepped forward and lowered himself to his knees beside her. The grass was damp beneath him, soaking through his trousers, but he did not notice. "Mrs. Thornton," he said quietly, addressing the headstone as if the woman herself could hear him. "You saved a monster 12 years ago, a stranger covered in blood, more dead than alive, and you dragged him into your home and stitched him back together." He paused, searching for words that seemed inadequate. "I don't know why you did it. I've never understood, but I swear to you, I'll spend the rest of my life being worthy of that mercy. I'll protect her. I'll love her. I'll give her everything you would have given her if you'd had more time." His voice cracked slightly. "Thank you for saving me, for raising her, for believing that even wolves deserve mercy in winter." Lily's small hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his larger ones. "You're not a monster, Dad," she said softly. He looked at her. Monsters don't cry when they watch sad movies. Dominic let out a breath that was almost a laugh. A real smile crossed his face, rare and genuine, transforming his harsh features into something approaching warmth. "Our secret," he said. "Our secret," she agreed. They stayed a while longer, sitting together before the grave, letting the peace of the place settle into their bones. Then, hand in hand, they rose and walked back toward the waiting car. A breeze stirred the branches of the oak tree, rustling through the new spring leaves. It carried with it the faint scent of violets, sweet and delicate, wrapping around them like an embrace. Lily stopped at the edge of the path. She turned back toward the grave, toward the headstone dappled with sunlight and shadow, and raised her hand in a wave. "Bye, Grandma," she called out, her voice bright with love and promise. "I'll come back. I promise," the wind whispered through the trees. And somewhere, somehow, Lily knew her grandmother had heard. 5 years had passed since the day Lily Thornton called Dominic Vale her father. She was 12 now, no longer the skeletal child with haunted eyes who had been found in a frozen shed. She stood tall for her age, her dark hair falling past her shoulders, her amber eyes bright with intelligence and compassion. The hollowness had been replaced by strength. The silence had been replaced by purpose. Maggie's light had grown beyond anything Dominic had imagined. What began as a small foundation had become a beacon of hope across the Pacific Northwest. Over 200 children had been rescued from abusive situations, connected with resources, placed in safe homes, given second chances they never dreamed possible. Lily was the youngest volunteer in the organization. She visited shelters on weekends, sitting with children who reminded her of herself. Children with empty eyes and flinching reflexes, and hearts that had forgotten how to trust. "I know it's scary," she would tell them, her voice gentle but certain. "I know you think no one cares, that no one is coming, that maybe you deserve what's happening to you." She would take their hands in hers, meeting their frightened gazes without flinching. "But someone does care, and one day, you'll be safe. I promise." Dominic had left the shadows completely. The empire he had built over 2 decades had been systematically dismantled. Legitimate businesses separated from illegitimate ones. The latter quietly dissolved or handed off to others who had no connection to his new life. He sat on the board of 3 children's advocacy organizations. He testified before state legislators about reforming foster care systems. He donated millions to causes that would never know the origin of the money. The man who had once been feared by criminals and law enforcement alike now spent his evenings helping with homework and attending school plays and learning to cook meals that did not trigger smoke alarms. One autumn evening, Lily wandered into his study looking for a book. She found the handkerchief instead. It was tucked in the back of his desk drawer, carefully preserved in a clear protective sleeve. The white linen had yellowed with age. The violet flowers had faded. The bloodstains had turned brown, but the embroidered M in the corner was still visible, still elegant, still carrying the touch of hands that had been still for 6 years. "Dad?" Lily held up the handkerchief, her brow furrowed. "What is this?" Dominic looked at the cloth that had saved his life, that had led him back to her, that had connected their fates across 17 years and countless miles. He sat down in his chair and gestured for her to join him. Then he told her everything. The winter night when he was betrayed and left to die. The crawl through the snow. The cabin at the edge of the forest. The old woman who dragged a bleeding stranger into her home and stitched him back together with quilting thread and herbal remedies. The baby with amber eyes who watched over him through his fever dreams. The promise to repay a debt that the old woman never wanted repaid. The 12 years of searching. The discovery that came 6 months too late. The frozen shed. The chain on the door. the child who asked if he was going to hurt her too. Lily listened without interrupting, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. When he finished, she looked at the handkerchief in her hands, this fragile piece of cloth that had woven their lives together. "Grandma knew," she whispered. "She always knew you'd come back for us." Dominic's throat tightened. "I don't know if she knew. I don't know if she even remembered me." Lily shook her head, a smile breaking through her tears. "She knew. She used to tell me stories about a wolf in winter who turned out to be something else. I never understood what she meant." She looked up at him with those amber eyes that had first seen him 17 years ago. "Now I do." She rose from her chair and wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face against his chest the way she had on the night he found her under the bed, the night Derek came with a gun, the night everything could have ended differently. Dominic held her close. This child who had become his daughter, his purpose, his redemption. Some debts can never be repaid. But Margaret Thornton had never wanted repayment. She had only wanted the seed of kindness she planted to bloom. And bloom it did. In the man who learned to love. In the child who learned to live again. In the hundreds of young lives touched by a foundation that bore her name. The violet handkerchief now hangs framed in Lily's room. It is the first thing she sees each morning, and the last thing she sees each night. A reminder that one act of mercy, offered without expectation, without condition, without hesitation, can echo through generations. A reminder that kindness is never wasted. A reminder that even wolves deserve mercy in winter. And sometimes, mercy transforms them into something more. This story carries profound lessons about life and the boundless value of human compassion. It teaches us that kindness, even extended to strangers, can ripple through time in ways we may never witness. It reminds us that healing is possible, that broken hearts can mend, that children who have known darkness can learn to embrace light. It shows us that redemption exists for those willing to reach for it, that family is not defined by blood but by choice, that the strongest people are not those who never fall, but those who rise again and again. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with those who need to hear its message. Every click helps us bring more meaningful stories to audiences around the world. We would love to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? Have you witnessed similar acts of unexpected kindness in your own life? Do you know someone who needs to be reminded that help exists, that hope endures, that tomorrow can be different from today? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single response, and we treasure the opportunity to connect with hearts like yours. Thank you for staying with us until the end of today's story. We wish you and your loved ones good health, joyful days, and peace in every moment. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next video.